Without any further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Eero Vaara. Thank you very much again for being with us. It is an honor for us that you actually accepted our invitation. So thank you very much. He is Professor in Organization and Impact at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford. And his research focuses on strategic and institutional change. He has been published on several leading academic journals, such as, for example, Academy of Management Journal, and he has also served as an associate editor there, for example. And he has also received many awards. So that's why we even, since he's really focusing on his research on strategic and institutional change, we thought that it could provide us a really interesting perspective on strategic change and narrative perspectives. So if you would like to ask Professor Eero Vaara any questions, please do not hesitate. This is the link to the Pollev platform that we will use. So please feel free to write there any question that you might have. And even you can also open the mic at the end if you would even like to ask Professor Vaara directly questions. Okay, but without any further ado, I will leave the floor to Eero Vaara to actually start with his keynote. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for the very kind and generous introduction. So I'm very pleased, I could say. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be with you guys this afternoon, and I've been really looking forward to this for quite some time. Just to check that we are okay. You can see the presentation, or at least the first slide. There are not too many slides, but some slides coming up to help with the structure of the presentation. And I hope that then if I'm missing, there's so many people on my screen, and I have too many screens. So please just speak up if you have questions, if I'm missing some of them on the platform. But once again, thank you so much for having me. And it's I know it's a great crowd of people here, and I know that many of you are really the experts in terms of future making and also understanding how this is done both theoretically and in practice. So it's a wonderful place to be at, and I'm very excited for a couple of reasons. First is that the topic really speaks to me when we are thinking about the future, but by the way, not only the future in terms of what strategic change is. I think we are almost necessarily and inevitably dealing with narratives. That, of course, depends on the definition of narratives. But to me, narratives are the sense-making devices that help us to connect the past, the present, and future in one way or another. And I think that's what we're doing when we are imagining the futures. I hope it's a good idea. And if it's a bad idea, well, too late to change this. I hope it's a good idea not to only talk about the narratives of the future, but I'll start actually by saying a few words about the narratives we have with us when we are looking at the past, looking into the past to learn, for instance. And then, of course, narratives are the key in terms of scenarios and other key constructions in future making. So that's the second thing I will be focusing on. And then a third thing, narratives I found also very, very useful. I'm sure that you have found them as well, in terms of using them explicitly in strategy work when we are working with our colleagues to make sense of the key strategic initiatives and ideas and pinning down our plans for the future. So I think time is well spent on this topic. Also, as Ilaria, you were kindly mentioning, this is something that I've been working on quite a lot, academically, and I'll be making a couple of references to some publications and work on this front. But like you guys, I've also been, very much involved in strategic decision making and in all kinds of sessions of strategy work. So I have lots of, failures and successes on my mind. So I'll be drawing on them as well. But I'm really, really eager to see us engage in a conversation. So I'll try to live up to the expectations in terms of keeping this brief. So I'll try to do just that. But again, if there are any questions, we can take them at any point of time. But I think the plan is really good, so that I'll first spend about 20 minutes, and then we'll get into the questions. So this is what I have in mind, basically starting with a few points about narratives in terms of their role when we are making sense of the past. And by the way, at this point, I want to emphasize that when we're talking about strategic change, I think we have a whole lot of different kinds of narratives with us. And that's one of the purposes of this presentation, also to open it up in terms of understanding. It's about the history, it's about the future, it's about connecting the dots, also in terms of strategy making as it's happening today. So it's a little bit simplistic to say that it's history, it's future, but definitely it's also the present in terms of us in this present moment trying to make sense of what was before and what will be in the future, especially with strategy work in mind. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is that there are all kinds of narratives. I think we are inevitably dealing with narratives when we are making sense of strategic change, but it's also good to pause, to reflect at times and mindfully, and I know that you are doing exactly this in your projects, to pause to think about alternative futures, and I would say also it's useful to look at alternative pasts and the ways in which we reconstruct the past to understand the present and the future. So I hope that you are making some sense out of it. I'm also throwing in quite a few concepts, but I'm doing this on purpose, hoping that some of these will be hopefully inspiring in a sense of you guys moving forward with both research and practice in terms of imagining the future. So let's, instead of the future, let's start with history. So my historian friends, and there are a lot of historians in Oxford, and I have lots of friends also elsewhere in the world. So historians, I think, are really good because they kind of realize, and that's in their profession, that when we're dealing with the past, especially when we are describing what has happened in the past, it's never really objective. It's not objective in the sense that there would be like one way of telling the past. Now, I realize that this is different. If it's a startup which has already been there for a couple of months, it may be a different thing from, let's say, having a long-standing family firm in Milan, which has been there for 300 years. So there's much more to pick and choose in terms of the latter example. But I think the past in terms of change is about reconstructing what it was, and it inevitably means remembering and forgetting. So we're doing this anyway, but I'm just throwing in a couple of ways in which we can perhaps more mindfully think about the past. One is that we oftentimes tend to focus on the obvious turning points, obvious events or decisions and actions which were made at some points of time. And so the reconstructions of the past in terms of our narratives tend to be focusing on what I would say the obvious events or non-events taking place. However, sometimes it's really useful to also think about the other things that easily pass unnoticed. For instance, those turning points that people have been forgetting about, which nevertheless might have been really, really important. And if you allow me, I'll do a little bit of self-advertisement, since this is totally topical. This paper, which I was involved in co-authoring with my good friends in Finland, my other home country, deals with some forgotten turning points in the Finland-based Nokia Corporation's history in the 1970s and 80s. And we, it's fresh from the oven. I think it came out in paper form about like 10 days ago. So couldn't be more topical than this. It's a pretty theoretical paper, but I think it's cool in terms of really helping us to see that also those turning points, those events that we don't usually pay attention might have been really, really important. Another term, another way of constructing and thinking about these narratives is about counterfactuals. And I know that many of us, we are familiar with counterfactuals in the sense that counterfactuals are what didn't happen, might have happened. And this is also something that when we think about alternatives, is always more or less in the back of our minds. What I'm trying to say simply is that it's a very useful exercise. Sometimes look into the past and imagine what might have been, even if it didn't happen. This helps us to understand the importance of what we did decide upon, for instance, and helps us to also imagine alternative pathways. And this brings me to another concept that I want to throw at you. Also, a good way of potentially linking the past to the future. So there are people, historians in particular, who are excited about virtual histories. So those would be narratives that would be very much about imagining what could have been. So I'll just mention one person, a little bit of a controversial scholar. He is Niall Ferguson, who's also been at Oxford, who's famous for this. So he has written about things like, what if Hitler had won the Second World War? What would have happened? Now, this may be far removed from the realities of what you're doing in your companies or in your research efforts, but I think it's really, really a good idea sometimes to be mindful and reflect upon what might have been in the past, because the constructions of the past will have an impact on how we see the present as well as the future. So there are lots of narratives or narrative elements that deal with the past, and it's good to be at times mindful in terms of how we are reconstructing the past, in terms of key turning points or other alternative pathways that we or our companies might have been experiencing. But I know that you guys and the whole purpose of this is mostly about the future. So of course narratives are important for the future, imagining the future. And again, I realize that it's a question of definitions, like how we see narratives. But personally, I cannot think about the future without thinking of it as a narrative, especially if we are doing it collectively. If I have to, explain to you guys as to how I see the future of the Saïd Business School where I'm sitting at, it becomes a narrative about the future, really. Again, we can do this more mindfully. And again, I'm aware of the fact that some of you are real experts in scenarios. I'm also a big fan of scenario work. And I guess the strength in, or the power in developing scenarios lies in the fact that we may have alternative futures. So that is alternative narratives about the future. And let me advertise here our colleagues, Rafael Ramirez in particular, who's who's the lead author in this one paper. I won't go into the details of this paper, but there's this Oxford methodology in scenario planning, which I think is really cool, that Rafael and, for instance, Trudy Lang have been developing over time. And I've been talking a lot with them in terms of how the scenarios and narratives are the same or whether they are different things. And I think we are kind of converging on the idea that scenarios are narratives, but they also trigger the creation of new narratives. Because if we, move to a certain point in a scenario, it might be that if that's something that we want to aim at as a company, that then we should then backtrack and develop a narrative as to how to get to this point, especially if this becomes the vision or if it becomes a desirable future that we are aiming at. Now, there are lots of concepts here, and I promise I won't bring you too many of them anymore, but I hope that some of you are picking up some of these because they can be really useful. Here, I also want to advertise my colleagues, and of course, Ilaria, you know them very well, in particular Juliane Reinecke and others who have been writing about desirable futures, not only from a perspective of a particular company or organization, but how this may be important for larger scale change, for instance, in terms of sustainability, to give just one theme in terms of what would be important in terms of systems change. But to me, the desirable futures are narratives, or at least we need narratives about the desirable futures. Otherwise, they won't have the effect that people want to have with this imagination of desirable futures, which are important in terms of change to take place. And obviously, We need these kinds of narratives, whether we call them scenarios or desirable futures, or indeed superfactuals. I should also mention that. Those are like imaginative creations based on the counterfactuals. So counterfactuals are like what if something had happened. Superfactual is then the construction of what that might have been, and it can be actually really close to virtual histories or virtual representations or reconstructions of the future or desirable futures. Okay, so that's number 2. So we're talking about the past. We can also be focusing on the future. But then there's also the present in terms of using narratives and a narrative lens in strategy work. And this is really the final thing that I want to mention here. And then I have one example and some pointers as learning points. So I'm actually become a really big fan of this in terms of understanding strategies as narratives, and in strategy work, or what used to be called strategic planning, having an explicit narrative lens in terms of trying to, in the best of cases, in my view, to collectively create the narratives that would then become or be our strategies for the future. And you know, it's not that I'm inventing this. I think this is what is done a lot anyway. And just think about you know, examples that many of us know very well, like Steve Jobs back in the day, or Elon Musk. However, you know, you see these people have been really, I think, inspirational examples in terms of creating these images of the future, which are then the strategies or are close to the strategies that their companies have been following quite successfully. So in this sense, strategy work would be constructions of the past, present, and future. Sometimes the past would be more important, sometimes the past would be less important, but usually the future is very important in these narrative constructions. And what we have learned is that this seems to be working best if it involves, you know, a group of people or collectives, hopefully as much as possible, many members of the organization who would be jointly developing these narratives. Why? Because if people are engaged, obviously then the narratives that are created would be shared and would have some impact. And I'll give you one example. And this is from my other home country. And I should ask you at this point, what is the happiest country in the world? Anyone? I know that we're supposed to having a dialogue after this one, but anyone dare to say which one is the happiest country in the world?
Finland.
Finland, yeah. You know, if no one had mentioned that, we should have stopped the whole thing. But anyway, it makes me happy and sorry about being so childish in terms of bringing this in. Anyway, in that spirit, it has been quite a successful and happy process in this one city organization in Finland that I've had the opportunity to follow and partly be at times very much involved in their strategy work. But it's a really cool example that I've also written about in some articles, and this is the western part of the greater Helsinki area. So Helsinki is a little bit like Milan, although the food is better in Milan. So this would be the western part of Milan, but it's the western part of the Helsinki region, and it's a very interesting city organization. And just cutting some corners and making the story short, already a long time ago, around 2012, they elected a new mayor who's in one of these pictures above, in the one above, called Jukka Mäkelä. And he did a promise. He promised to do it differently, you know, turn the strategic planning processes upside down and to pursue a narrative approach in that. And then he got elected as a mayor, and he only just retired. So he was in charge not only for one round, but for a long time, like 4 rounds, when they have actually had a very extensive process involving a lot of internal and external stakeholders in 4 times developing and updating the strategy of the city organization that they have called Espoo Story. Espoo is the name of the city. Story, obviously, is narrative. So I won't have much time to mention many things about it. If you're interested, you could just Google, and you'll also find some videos where the mayor is explaining what they have been doing. What I've thought has been really cool in this is a sense of polyphony, to use a really fancy word. So it's not only like one narrative that they have created in terms of the strategy narrative for the whole city organization, but they've also encouraged people in different parts of the city organization to also develop their own narratives, like translations or versions of the big narrative that the city itself has been producing. And it's been pretty successful on all accounts. And of course, I'm very biased in this, but people have found it a very meaningful exercise. And it has not only created this really cool representations, also multimodal representations of the future of Espoo and how to get there, but also it has engaged a lot of people, which has been important per se in terms of making sure that the strategic ideas are not lost, but with the narratives, people have been sharing them and taking them further. Okay, we're almost there in terms of the schedule as well. So this, I promise, the very final slide. I just wanted to collect a few pointers in terms of what I would at least see as success factors. Perhaps that's a little bit of an exaggeration that if you think that this would be a formula to succeed in these narratives. But what I'm trying to say is that it's a really useful thing to at times create these narratives, either those about the past that we can learn from, or those about the future, and especially those that would connect the dots in terms of creating strategy narratives that might be both about the present and the future and being anchored in the past. So open-mindedness seems to be a learning point. So narratives work best when we are able to think differently, to open-mindedly reconsider how we have seen the past or the present situation or the alternative futures. They can all be like different narratives, or they can come together in specific narratives in the best of cases. Critical thinking comes with that, I guess, but it's also important that we cultivate this, especially in considering alternatives. I would again speak for counterfactuals. So considering what could have been, and also thinking about what, well, may have been forgotten about the past, or think about alternatives that are not the obvious ones for our companies in terms of the future narratives. It works collectively best if there's an ability to get people on board, hopefully making them enthusiastic about what's going on. And it doesn't mean that the scenarios, for instance, of the future narratives would only be, dance on roses, but that people would genuinely find meaning in these exercises in pinning down the futures of the organizations. I think it's a delicate balance in terms of combining what we can see as fact and what could be in terms of an imagined future, for instance, in terms of fiction. In the best of cases, people can connect those dots. I've kind of mentioned this already. Collective engagement, I think, is the key, so that any such exercises or the narratives we create would have some impact. Well, they would have impact if people have been involved in creating those. And the final point is just to say that when we're talking about narratives, it doesn't mean like, books or Word documents or PDF files or PowerPoints only, but the world is full of opportunities in terms of different kinds of multimodal representations. If you go to the Espoo case that I've been advertising, you'll see a lot of those in terms of videos, for instance, produced with different kinds of actors and audiences. I know that my time is up, so looking forward to the questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation and the insights that you provided to us. We actually gathered some questions from our audience. So maybe I will start by asking the first question that a participant asked, which is about how do you balance the need for critical thinking with the goal of positivity enthusiasm? Can a narrative be too positive to the point that it ignores necessary strategic warnings?
I think it's a great question. To be honest, in my experience, I think we're probably oftentimes doing it well in terms of scenario work. If I'm using that terminology, in terms of scenario work, kind of brings us to think about the utopias or the really positive futures, as well as the dystopias, like what could happen, like the nightmare scenarios, so to speak. So I think there's a balance there, and in the best of cases, one could be critical and think about alternative futures, even if they have the nightmare scenarios, as long as people are excited about the process and see meaning and legitimacy in what is being done. Be that a particular workshop, for instance, for scenarios, or a process of narrative strategy work as in Espoo. To be honest, I think in strategy work, we oftentimes have a really, really big bias, which is towards positivity in terms of, precisely getting carried away about visions and goals that are overly optimistic. And that's kind of inbuilt because, we want to make the world a better place. We want to improve the strategic position of our companies. We want to be more profitable, or we want to grow usually. So there is this bias, and that's there. And in a way, we need this because people want to see improvement, a good future, a better future. But that shouldn't mean that then our reflections about the alternatives would only be the positive ones. And again, I personally think narratives are useful in this sense because, as in scenario type of narratives, we can have alternative paths and we can consider those things. We can also pause to reflect upon like certain decisions or steps, either in the past, but also in terms of the future, and then see like alternative pathways. But I think it's hard. Positivity and criticality, hard to marry at times.
Thank you very much for the response. And then another participant is asking, can narratives be used not only to imagine possible and desirable futures, but also to backcast from those imagined futures to identify the strategic actions that we should take today? And if so, how can we do that?
Yeah, again, a brilliant question. I wish that my good friend Rafael Ramirez was here. Actually, I did tell him, honestly, in the afternoon that I'm going to have this wonderful opportunity to engage with you guys. And I was going to say that I'm going to advertise his or their scenario planning approach. But his view, I think, is very useful here. So it's precisely that we have to be very mindful, and usually it takes a lot of effort to create these scenarios that then, in the best of cases, are plausible scenarios. And then it may be that one of them serves as an endpoint, as in terms of a desirable future. So we want to go there. Now, what he says is that we should then have a counter narrative. I actually don't like the use of this term in this way. I think it's wrong. But let's pretend I'm Rafael. So Rafael says we should imagine the reverse, which is exactly the essence of the question, which is that then if we have the future, then we should backtrack. And like the counter in Rafael's thinking means going from the future to the present and backtracking decision points, decisions, and actions. Whatever we call this, I think that's the way it goes. Like it goes back and forth. And with this, we are creating a narrative from the present to the future. But I should add, in my view, it almost always also relates to the past, in terms of the past has brought us here, which might be a good point or problematic point where we are. And then from that angle, we create the scenarios and finally then connect the dots in terms of the narrative to get to this better place.
Perfect. Thank you very much even for sharing, let's say, Rafael Ramirez's perspective, which nicely integrates with yours. So thanks again even for this. And then we have another question from another participant that is asking, how can organizations ensure that narratives actively shape strategic judgment and resource allocation instead of becoming post hoc justifications or branding devices that are disconnected from core strategic trade-offs?
Yeah, again, a brilliant question. In some ways, I think this is true for any kind of representation that we create in strategy work. That it's not obvious if it's a small bunch of top managers, for instance, creating these, then others would become aware. I mean, if the organization is a big one in particular, that all people would somehow then understand the importance of these creations. So I think that's a constant challenge, probably the biggest challenge in strategy work, in terms of getting from this, from these wonderful formulations of strategies to their actual implementation. But I'm speaking for narratives today. So I'm saying that actually narratives are more helpful ways of creating the representations and sharing this than many others, because in the best of cases with narratives, we can make them appealing. We can create narratives that are that resonate with people's experiences. So that's one. And the other thing then is that, and that's what I'm really, really drawing from the Espoo case, and apologies if I'm advertising the Espoo case too much, but I think it's a wonderful example because it did involve basically, in principle, everyone in the city organization, so like tens of thousands of people. And not only that, but they also reached out to the inhabitants, so basically 300,000 people. Well, not all people participated, but like if the narrative making itself involves a lot of people, then that's like already, you've gone halfway, I would say, if you